Russian President Vladimir Putin says fighting has, quote, intensified in southeastern Ukraine, and it comes as Kyiv continues its counteroffensive against Russian forces. Meanwhile, Russia is still bombarding Ukrainian port cities, and at least one person was killed and a cargo terminal was damaged overnight in Odesa. According to Ukrainian officials, the missiles were launched from a submarine. Ramy Inocencio joins us now from Ukraine's capital to talk about this. So listen, Ramy, what more can you tell us about Ukraine's counteroffensive and I guess how slowly it's going?
Yeah, good point on the slow part, Anne-Marie. Despite what we're hearing in terms of reporting out of Washington, D.C., which is that a counteroffensive thrust may be starting to happen, what we're hearing here in Kyiv is that there is no counteroffensive happening, or at least no official confirmation from Ukraine's military. Now, with that said, Ukraine's general staff has said that there is at least a continuation of fighting towards the south in Zaporizhia region. This is along the front lines, the southern front lines here. And what's happening is that the military is apparently trying to continue to drive a wedge through Russian forces towards the Sea of Azov. These are the cities of Melitopol, slightly towards the east, and the city of Berdyansk, slightly towards the west. Now, the reason here is they're trying to cut off Russian forces from Crimea across the so-called land bridge there. As you just said, though, that if people don't want to talk about it, at least the Russian reaction is that there is something happening, massive bombardment across the south of Ukraine. In addition, Mr. Putin saying that there is an uptick in hostilities. But to the point that there might or might not be a counteroffensive happening, we spoke to the head of public relations for the Territorial Defense Forces. This is basically a kind of a light infantry or volunteer army here. And he was just telling us just hours ago that, you know, plans love silence. And he really criticized the reporting coming out of Washington, D.C., saying that if there is anything that people know out there, please don't talk about it.
So in regards to sort of the front lines, the real focus, I had heard, even though, you know, plans like silence, you know, part of the reporting is that Ukrainians are being bombarded by, you know, Russian weaponry. Do we know how things are looking along the front lines?
Yeah, it's not a question of progress in terms of mile by mile, if that's what anyone is hoping for. It's more a question of inch by inch, yard by yard. And as it was pointed out to us, even if land itself could be taken, if troops could be taken out between Ukraine towards Russia, there is the issue of massive amounts of landmines, trenches, and then troops to meet them. In effect, what's happening, if Ukrainian troops were able to capture some ground, then they would be, in effect, isolated, and then Russian forces would then be able to target them easily. So what we're seeing is sort of like more of a back and forth, and then this kind of no man's land where there is ground that is very difficult to, if you can get it, then to hold on to it. So it's pretty much a stalemate, and that's why we're not seeing very much progress here. We did ask about whether there could be any signs of any liberated cities in the near future. They were very much mum on that, but they do want to at least boost morale in terms of any successes. But again, we're not hearing very much from them.
So in the meantime, there is a very interesting gathering happening in Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin has been meeting with African leaders and delegations in St. Petersburg. As you know, Russia has sort of put an end to the grain deal that was allowing for grain to leave the Black Sea. And there are a number of countries on the African continent that would have depended on that grain, and depending on that grain to be a price that is affordable. So it looks as if, and I think this may be a semi-regular gathering, but it looks as if Vladimir Putin is trying to woo some of these leaders. Can you kind of talk about the significance of this gathering?
Yes, the Russia-Africa summit happening right now in St. Petersburg. The last time was 4 years ago in Sochi, so every 4 years. To your point, though, in terms of trying to woo African countries, he has actually said that he's going to be giving free grain to many of them, on the order of 25 to 50,000 tons per country over the next 3 to 4 months. Now, the reason for this is because, as you say, Moscow pulled out of the Black Sea grain deal initiative just about 10 days ago. The concern there is that African countries which rely on Ukraine would basically be under stress in terms of feeding their own peoples. So Russia trying to push in here. However, with that said, if you take a look at the attendees, the number of attendees, the heads of state that are in St. Petersburg right now, that implies that there's far less trust now than there was 4 years ago. The reason for this is because on the order of maybe 21 or so African leaders are now meeting with President Putin this week. But if you contrast that with the numbers happening 4 years ago, that was more than double. About 45 African leaders went to see him then in Sochi. And then if you compare it just with December, not with President Putin, but with President Biden, about 50 African leaders flew to Washington, D.C. to meet with Mr. Biden. That's when he was announcing billions in dollars of aid and investment there. So in terms of Russia trying to woo African countries, we also have to look at the fact that it's his budget, his economy is strained, so he really doesn't have much to dangle in front of them.
Yeah, really great point. You know, a number of these countries have been hesitant to be overtly critical of Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. Yeah. But at the same time, you know, you don't want to alienate yourself from the West. Countries like the U.S., as you point out, that may be providing significant amounts of aid. Ramy, thank you very much.